The most important person in the room is usually the one nobody notices. The private dining room on the top floor of the Grand Wellington overlooked the glowing Manhattan skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the city lights like scattered diamonds across the glass, while the soft sound of piano music drifted through the restaurant. At a polished oak table near the window sat Ethan Brooks, a billionaire known across the country for building one of the largest technology companies in America. Yet tonight, the success, the tailored navy suit, and the headlines meant very little. His attention remained fixed on the small boy sitting beside him. 10-year-old Noah Brooks stared quietly out the window. He hadn't touched the sparkling water in front of him. He hadn't looked at the menu. He hadn't spoken a single word during the entire drive into the city. Ethan tried not to show the worry in his eyes. It had been almost a year since Noah lost his mother. A year of doctors, therapists, specialists. None of them could bring back the bright, curious child Ethan remembered. The boy still spoke when necessary, but only barely. Most days he seemed trapped behind an invisible wall. Across the table sat Kenji Nakamura, a respected Japanese millionaire whose logistics empire stretched across 3 continents. His silver tie was perfectly straight, his expression calm. His posture carried the quiet confidence of a man who had spent decades negotiating billion-dollar agreements. Tonight's dinner was supposed to finalize a partnership that business journalists had already started calling the deal of the decade. Yet Kenji's attention drifted away from financial projections and market forecasts. Instead, he found himself watching Noah. The boy remained silent, motionless, almost invisible. A waitress approached carrying a tray of drinks. Her name tag read Emily Carter, 27 years old, blonde hair neatly tied back, simple black uniform, quiet eyes. Most guests never remembered her face after a meal. She moved through the room with the kind of calm that often goes unnoticed. Emily carefully placed the glasses on the table and stepped back. Ethan barely looked up. Kenji offered a polite nod. Noah continued staring toward the city lights. The silence lingered, heavy, uncomfortable. Then Kenji slowly turned toward the boy. For several seconds, he studied him without speaking. His eyes softened. Something about Noah reminded him of someone he had known many years ago. Finally, Kenji exhaled and quietly spoke in Japanese. Kodomo wa kanashimi o kokoro no oku ni kakushite iru. The words were gentle, barely above a whisper. Ethan couldn't understand them. Noah didn't react. The room remained still. But near the table, Emily suddenly stopped moving. The tray slipped slightly in her hands. Her breath caught. For the first time all evening, her calm expression changed. She recognized every word. Kenji noticed immediately. His eyes lifted from Noah and settled on the shy waitress standing several feet away. Emily lowered her gaze, hoping no one had seen her reaction. But it was too late. Kenji had seen it. And in that moment, something unexpected passed between them. Recognition, surprise, curiosity. Ethan followed Kenji's gaze and finally looked at the waitress. For a brief second, the entire room felt strangely quiet. The city lights shimmered outside the windows. The piano continued somewhere in the distance. And standing beside a table worth billions of dollars, a shy waitress tried to pretend she hadn't understood a sentence spoken halfway around the world. Emily lowered her eyes and carefully adjusted her grip on the tray. For most people in the restaurant, the moment had already passed. A billionaire, a foreign businessman, a quiet child, nothing unusual. But Kenji Nakamura continued watching her. Not with suspicion, not with judgment, with curiosity. The kind of curiosity that appears when someone discovers a detail that does not fit the picture in front of them. Emily turned away and walked toward the service station. Her steps remained steady, but her heart was no longer calm. She knew exactly what Kenji had said. The child is hiding his grief deep inside his heart. It was not a complicated sentence, yet it carried a weight that most translators would never fully capture. It was not simply an observation. It was compassion. Across the dining room, Ethan noticed the exchange but quickly dismissed it. His attention drifted back to Noah. The boy had not reacted to the Japanese words. He continued staring at the skyline where thousands of lights shimmered against the dark evening sky. Ethan followed his son's gaze. Sometimes he wondered what Noah was thinking. Other times he wondered if Noah wanted to think about anything at all. The distance between them felt larger every month. Not because they loved each other less, because grief had settled into the empty spaces between conversations. The waiter assigned to the room approached the table carrying menus. Kenji accepted his politely. Ethan nodded. Noah did not move. The restaurant's soft lighting reflected against the crystal glasses. Somewhere beyond the private room, dishes clinked and distant laughter floated through the hall. Life continued normally for everyone else. Ethan wished it felt normal for them too. Meanwhile, Emily stood near the espresso station preparing coffee orders. Another server leaned beside her. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly. Emily forced a small smile. "Of course." The answer came automatically. It always did. People rarely asked a second time. Emily preferred it that way. She had spent years becoming invisible. Invisible people were left alone. Invisible people were safe. Yet tonight something felt different. Her eyes drifted toward the private dining room again, toward the quiet boy sitting beside one of the most powerful men in the country. She recognized that look. Not because she was a psychologist. Not because she had special training. Because years ago she had worn the same expression herself. The same silence. The same invisible weight. Back at the table, Kenji slowly folded his menu. "Your son reminds me of someone," he said. Ethan offered a tired smile. "Hopefully someone happier." Kenji's eyes softened. "Not happier. Stronger than people realized." Ethan glanced toward Noah. The boy remained silent. "I'm not sure strength is what I see these days." For a moment neither man spoke. Then Kenji looked through the glass wall toward the restaurant floor. His gaze found Emily almost. Instantly, she was helping another table. Calm. Professional. Unremarkable to anyone who was not paying attention. "Interesting," Kenji murmured. Ethan followed his line of sight. "What is?" Kenji took a sip of water before answering. "Some people spend their lives speaking loudly so others will notice them." His eyes remained on Emily. "And some people learn very early that silence can reveal much more." At that exact moment Emily looked up. Across the room, her eyes met Kenji's once again. And this time, neither of them looked away immediately. The look lasted only a second. Then Emily lowered her gaze and returned to work. To everyone else, it was meaningless. Just a waitress moving through another busy evening. But Kenji Nakamura was not everyone else. He had spent 40 years studying people. Not balance sheets. Not contracts. People. He knew confidence when he saw it. He knew insecurity. He knew ambition. And he knew the difference between someone pretending to understand and someone who truly did. Emily Carter had not reacted like a person who recognized a few foreign words. She had reacted like someone who understood their meaning. Across the table, Ethan adjusted his cuff and glanced at his watch. The evening schedule was already running behind. Investors were waiting for updates. Attorneys expected revisions before midnight. Yet none of that felt important at the moment. His attention kept drifting back to Noah. The boy had not spoken once since arriving. Even when their car crossed the Brooklyn Bridge earlier that evening, revealing one of the most beautiful views in New York, Noah had simply stared through the window in silence. Ethan remembered another version of his son. A version that asked endless questions. A version that laughed too loudly during movies and filled every quiet moment with curiosity. Sometimes he worried those memories were becoming harder to hold on to. Sometimes he feared he was forgetting the sound of his son's happiness. The thought settled heavily in his chest. "Noah," Ethan said softly, "would you like something different for dinner?" The boy remained focused on the city lights. No answer. Ethan forced a small smile. Anyway, rejection no longer surprised him. It simply hurt less visibly now. Kenji observed the exchange without comment. After a few moments, he carefully unfolded a linen napkin and placed it across his lap. "You love him very much," he said quietly. Ethan laughed once. Not because it was funny, because it was obvious. More than anything. Kenji nodded. "Then do not mistake silence for absence." Ethan looked at him. "What does that mean?" Kenji's eyes drifted toward Noah. "Some people stop speaking because they have nothing to say. Others stop speaking because their hearts are carrying too much." Ethan followed his gaze. The words lingered. Across the dining room, Emily was preparing a fresh pot of tea. She could not hear every detail of the conversation, but she recognized enough. Grief had a language of its own. You did not need perfect hearing to understand it. A young server approached her station carrying empty glasses. "Table 12 says thank you for the recommendation." Emily smiled politely. "That is good." The server paused. "You seem distracted tonight." Emily glanced toward the private room. "Just for a moment. Maybe a little." The younger woman followed her gaze. The billionaire? Emily shook her head. The kid. Her answer surprised even herself. Back inside the private room, Noah finally moved. Not much. Just enough to reach for the glass of water in front of him. The tiny movement caught Ethan's attention immediately. Parents notice things other people miss. Noah took a small sip and returned the glass to the table. Then, for the first time all evening, his eyes shifted away from the skyline. Slowly, quietly, almost cautiously, they landed on Emily across the room. And somehow, from half a dining room away, the shy waitress noticed. For a brief moment, neither of them looked away. Noah sat perfectly still at the table. Emily stood near the tea station, holding a silver kettle. The distance between them was more than 30 feet, yet something silent seemed to pass through the space. Not recognition, not familiarity, something gentler, understanding. Noah lowered his eyes first. He turned back toward the window, but the moment had already happened. Ethan noticed it immediately. Parents notice everything when they are worried. He followed his son's gaze toward the restaurant floor and saw the waitress again. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention. She moved quietly between tables, carrying plates, refilling glasses, speaking softly to guests. Yet Ethan could not ignore the strange feeling that she had somehow reached Noah without saying a word. Interesting, Kenji said quietly. Ethan looked up. What is? The Japanese businessman folded his hands together. Your son noticed her. Ethan glanced toward Noah. He notices lots of people. Kenji shook his head. No. He watches people. That is different. Ethan considered the comment. The distinction sounded small, but somehow it felt important. Before he could respond, Emily approached their table carrying a fresh pot of tea. Her expression remained calm and professional. Would anyone like a refill? She asked. Kenji smiled politely. Please. Emily poured carefully into his cup. The tea released a light floral aroma into the air. When she reached Ethan's glass, he thanked her with a brief nod. Then she turned toward Noah. Most servers would have ignored him. Many adults did. They assumed silence meant disinterest. Emily did not. She crouched slightly so she would not tower over him. Would you like some warm tea, Noah? Her voice was gentle, natural. No exaggerated kindness. No pity. Noah did not answer immediately. Ethan prepared for the usual silence. Instead, something unexpected happened. Noah slowly looked at the cup, then at Emily. After several seconds, he gave the smallest nod. Barely noticeable, but it was there. Ethan felt his breath catch. Emily smiled softly. Not triumphantly, not dramatically, as though the response was perfectly ordinary. She carefully poured the tea and placed the cup within Noah's reach. It is honey chamomile, she said. It is my favorite on cold nights. Noah stared at the steam rising from the cup. Emily stood and returned to her work without another word. No pressure, no expectation, just quiet respect. Kenji watched her leave. Then he turned toward Ethan. She understands something many people forget. Ethan kept his eyes on Noah. What is that? Kenji lifted his tea. People speak long before they use words. The sentence settled over the table. Ethan glanced at his son again. Noah had wrapped both hands around the warm cup. It was such a small gesture, yet it felt larger than any business agreement waiting to be signed that evening. Across the dining room, Emily resumed her work as though nothing unusual had happened. But deep inside, memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit had begun to stir. Because years ago, someone had once spoken to her the very same way. Quietly, patiently, without demanding that she be anything other than exactly who she was. The evening moved forward, but something inside the private dining room had quietly shifted. The contract folders remained on the table. Market projections waited on tablet screens. Numbers worth hundreds of millions of dollars set only inches away from Ethan and Kenji. Yet neither man seemed particularly interested in discussing them. Their attention kept returning to the same place. Noah. The boy sat with both hands wrapped around the warm tea cup. The steam curled upward in thin silver ribbons. For several minutes, he simply watched it rise. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he took another sip. Ethan noticed immediately. The tea itself was nothing remarkable. But Noah rarely accepted anything unfamiliar. Since losing his mother, routine had become his shelter. Any change, no matter how small, usually met resistance. Tonight was different. Across the room, Emily carried a tray toward another table. She never looked directly at Noah. She did not hover nearby. She did not try to earn his trust. Somehow that made her presence feel even more genuine. Kenji studied the scene quietly. Then he glanced toward Ethan. May I tell you a story? Ethan looked up. Of course. Kenji folded his hands. His voice remained calm. When I was 12 years old, my father lost everything. His company collapsed. My family moved from a large house into a small apartment. Overnight, everyone treated him differently. Ethan listened carefully. That must have been difficult. Kenji nodded. For months my father barely spoke. Every day he sat by the same window and stared outside. Ethan's eyes drifted toward Noah. The similarity was impossible to ignore. Kenji continued. One afternoon, an elderly neighbor brought him tea. She did not offer advice. She did not tell him to be strong. She simply sat beside him in silence. The Japanese businessman paused. A faint smile touched his face. After 3 months, that was the first day my father spoke again. Ethan remained silent. The restaurant lights reflected softly against the table. What did he say? Kenji asked. He thanked her. The answer was simple, yet it carried surprising weight. Across the room, Emily paused while arranging silverware at a nearby station. She could not hear the conversation, but she saw Noah sitting differently now. Less rigid, less guarded. The change was subtle. Most people would never notice. Emily did. Years of watching people had taught her that healing rarely arrived all at once. It arrived in tiny moments. A glance, a nod, a single sip of tea. Back at the table, Noah suddenly reached into the pocket of his sweatshirt. Ethan frowned slightly. The movement seemed random. Noah pulled out a folded piece of paper. The edges were worn from being opened and closed many times. Without speaking, he placed it on the table. Ethan's heart tightened. He recognized it immediately. It was one of the last drawings Noah's mother had made before she passed away. Noah carried it everywhere. Usually he never showed it to anyone. Kenji's expression softened. Neither man spoke. Noah carefully unfolded the paper and stared at it. Then, for the briefest moment, his eyes lifted toward Emily across the room. And this time, when their gazes met, he did not look away first. Emily froze for half a second. Not because Noah was looking at her, because of what he was holding. Even from across the room, she could see the care with which he handled the folded paper. Children only protected certain things that way. Memories, promises, pieces of people they were afraid to lose. She looked away first, giving him the privacy he deserved. Yet something in her chest tightened. The restaurant lights glowed warmly against the polished wood floors. Soft piano music drifted through the dining room. Around them, conversations continued. Glasses clinked. Servers moved between tables. But inside the private room, the atmosphere felt entirely different. Noah carefully traced one corner of the drawing with his finger. Ethan watched silently. He knew every crease in that piece of paper. He had seen Noah unfold it hundreds of times. Usually alone. Usually at night. Never in front of strangers. Kenji noticed the significance immediately. Someone important drew that, he said gently. Noah lowered his eyes to the page. The silence stretched for several seconds. Ethan did not interrupt. He had learned that pushing only caused Noah to retreat further. Finally, Noah gave a small nod. Kenji smiled softly. Your mother? Another pause. Then Noah nodded again. Ethan felt emotion rise unexpectedly in his chest. It was such a small response. Yet it was more engagement than many adults had managed in months. Across the room, Emily quietly arranged a stack of dessert plates. Her hands moved automatically while her thoughts drifted elsewhere. She remembered carrying something similar when she was younger. Not a drawing. A handwritten note. A few lines of encouragement from someone she loved deeply. She had kept it folded inside her wallet for years. Sometimes people did not hold on to objects because they were valuable. They held on to them because they were anchors. Proof that love had once existed. Proof that it still did. Back at the table, Kenji leaned back slightly. His expression remained thoughtful. Then he spoke a short sentence in Japanese. Calm. Measured. Almost musical. Ethan could not understand the words. Noah looked up briefly. The boy seemed curious, though he did not speak. Several feet away, Emily heard every syllable. Kenji had said, the people we love never disappear. They simply learn how to stay in different ways. Her breath caught. The sentence was old. Traditional. The kind of wisdom often passed from one generation to another. Before she could stop herself, Emily glanced toward the table. Kenji was already looking at her. He knew she had understood. There was no doubt now. For a moment neither moved. Then Kenji spoke again. Another sentence in Japanese. Slightly more complex this time. Ethan frowned, unable to follow the exchange. Noah quietly listened. Emily stared at the floor for a second. She could remain silent. That would be safer. Easier. The choice she always made. Yet when she lifted her eyes again and saw Noah holding that worn drawing, something changed. Very gently, almost like a whisper carried across the room, she answered in flawless Japanese. The words floated through the silence. And for the first time that evening, both Ethan and Noah looked at her in complete surprise. The room went completely still. Even the distant piano seemed softer for a moment. Emily stood beside the service station, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter. She had not raised her voice. She had not stepped into the room. Yet every eye at the table was suddenly on her. The sentence she had spoken in Japanese was simple, respectful, beautiful in its quietness. The heart remembers what the eyes can no longer see. Kenji blinked once. Then again, genuine surprise crossed his face. Not because she knew Japanese. He had suspected that already. What surprised him was the way she spoke it. The pronunciation was flawless. The rhythm natural. More importantly, she had answered the meaning behind his words, not merely the language itself. Ethan stared at her. For several seconds he forgot about contracts, meetings, and schedules. "You speak Japanese?" he finally asked. Emily seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention. "A little," she replied softly. Kenji laughed quietly. It was the first time anyone at the table had heard him laugh all evening. That is what experts always say. Emily lowered her eyes. "I am just a waitress." Kenji shook his head gently. "No, you are someone who understands." The words hung in the air. Noah looked from Kenji to Emily, then back again. For the first time since arriving, curiosity appeared in his expression. Small, fragile, but unmistakable. Emily noticed it immediately. So did Ethan. The billionaire felt a flicker of hope he had almost forgotten existed. Across the room, another server called Emily's name. She excused herself politely and returned to work. Yet the atmosphere had already changed. Noah watched her disappear behind a row of tables. The folded drawing remained in front of him. His fingers rested on the paper. Thoughtful. Quiet. Kenji leaned forward slightly. "May I ask you something?" Noah looked at him cautiously. The boy did not answer, but he did not look away either. Kenji smiled. "Did your mother draw that picture?" Noah's eyes dropped to the page. After a moment, he nodded. Ethan held his breath. Every response felt precious now. Every small step mattered. Kenji looked at the drawing carefully. "She must have loved you very much." Noah stared at the picture. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge. Then something unexpected happened. His lips parted. Not fully, just enough for a single word to emerge. Barely louder than a whisper. "Yes." Ethan froze. The word was so quiet, he almost thought he imagined it. But he had heard it. Kenji had heard it too. Noah immediately lowered his gaze afterward, as if surprised by his own voice. Yet the word remained in the air. Real. Undeniable. Ethan felt emotion rise in his chest so suddenly he had to look away for a second. Across the dining room, Emily was carrying a tray toward another table when she noticed the expression on Ethan's face. Then she looked at Noah. Somehow she understood. Not what had been said, not the exact conversation, but she understood that something important had happened. Kenji watched her from across the room and slowly smiled, because he had a feeling the evening was only beginning. And because sometimes the person who changes a life does not sit at the center of the table. Sometimes they are the quiet person everyone almost overlooked. The single word lingered in the room long after Noah had spoken it. Yes, it was only one word. For letters, barely audible. Yet to Ethan, it felt louder than every business victory he had celebrated during the past year. He looked down at the table and blinked slowly. The emotion in his eyes was impossible to hide. Noah had spoken. Not because someone demanded it. Not because a specialist encouraged it. He had spoken because he wanted to. Across the table, Kenji remained calm, though a quiet satisfaction softened his expression. He understood the importance of small moments. In his experience, lives rarely changed all at once. They changed one step at a time. One conversation. One act of kindness. One unexpected connection. The dinner continued, but the atmosphere had transformed. The contract folders remained untouched. Financial projections sat forgotten beside half-finished glasses of water. Outside the windows, Manhattan sparkled beneath the night sky. Inside, Something far more valuable was unfolding. A few minutes later, Emily returned carrying a tray with the main course. She moved carefully toward the private room and placed each plate with practiced grace. Her attention remained professional, respectful. She never mentioned the Japanese conversation. She never drew attention to herself. Yet as she set a plate in front of Kenji, the businessman suddenly spoke in Japanese once more. This time the sentence was longer, more formal, more difficult. It contained expressions rarely used outside traditional literature. Ethan immediately noticed the change in tone. Noah looked up as well. Emily paused for the briefest moment. Then she answered. Her Japanese was flawless. Not merely conversational. Elegant. Refined. The response came naturally, as though she had spent years immersed in the language. Kenji's eyebrows rose. Genuine surprise flashed across his face. That expression is nearly 200 years old, he said, now speaking in English. Emily seemed embarrassed by the attention. My professor used to love traditional literature, she replied softly. Ethan stared at her. Professor? Emily immediately realized she had revealed more than intended. A faint blush touched her cheeks. A long time ago. Kenji smiled knowingly. Most people do not learn classical Japanese by accident. Emily lowered her eyes and adjusted a fork beside one of the plates. For a second it seemed she might refuse to answer. Then she spoke quietly. I studied at Kyoto International University. Silence followed. Ethan looked genuinely stunned. Even Kenji appeared impressed. Kyoto International University was respected around the world. It was not the kind of place people casually attended. Emily quickly stepped back. Please enjoy your dinner. She turned to leave. But before she could walk away, a small voice stopped her. The voice was soft, careful, uncertain, yet everyone at the table heard it clearly. Did you live in Japan? Noah asked. Emily froze. Ethan froze. Even Kenji blinked. The room became perfectly silent once again, because Noah had just spoken a full sentence. And for the first time all evening, he was not speaking to his father. He was speaking to her. Emily forgot to breathe for a moment. The question was simple, innocent, yet it carried more weight than anyone else in the room could understand. Noah was looking directly at her. Not through her. Not past her. At her. The shy waitress who had spent the entire evening trying not to be noticed suddenly found herself standing at the center of the room. Ethan remained perfectly still. He did not want to interrupt. He did not want to risk breaking whatever fragile bridge had begun forming between his son and the world around him. Kenji sat quietly as well, observing with patient curiosity. Emily slowly nodded. Yes, she said softly. I lived there for almost 3 years. Noah glanced down at the drawing in his hands and then back at her. Did you like it? Another question. Another complete sentence. Ethan felt his chest tighten again. Emily smiled. Not the professional smile she used for customers. A real one. Warm and genuine. Very much, she answered. Especially in the spring. Noah tilted his head slightly. Why spring? Emily hesitated for a second, as though searching through old memories. Then she looked toward the window where the city lights shimmered against the dark sky. Because everything looked hopeful, she said. The cherry blossoms would bloom, and for a few weeks the whole world seemed different. People would stop rushing. They would sit together in parks. They would look up instead of down. Noah listened carefully. Every word seemed to matter. Emily continued quietly. My professor used to tell us that the blossoms were beautiful because they did not last forever. Noah frowned slightly. That sounds sad. Kenji smiled into his tea. Ethan watched his son with growing amazement. Emily considered the question. I thought so too at first. Her voice remained calm. But he explained that temporary things can still be beautiful. Sometimes they are beautiful because they are temporary. Silence settled over the table. Not an uncomfortable silence. A thoughtful one. Noah lowered his eyes to the drawing again. His fingers touched one corner gently. Emily immediately understood what he was thinking about. So did Kenji. Across the room, the restaurant continued operating around them. Servers carried plates. Guests laughed softly. Glasses reflected golden light. Yet inside the private dining room, the world felt smaller. More personal. Noah looked at the drawing for several seconds before speaking again. My mom liked flowers. The words came quietly. But they came. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. It was the first spontaneous mention of Noah's mother he had heard in months. Emily did not rush to respond. She gave the sentence room to breathe. Room to exist. Then she nodded. She sounds like someone who noticed beautiful things. Noah stared at the picture. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Small, almost invisible, yet Ethan saw it immediately. It felt like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm. Kenji leaned back in his chair and watched the scene unfold. The billionaire beside him had spent millions searching for answers. Experts, treatments, programs. Yet tonight, the first real breakthrough had begun with a cup of tea and a waitress who understood how to listen. And somewhere deep inside, Kenji had a feeling that Emily Carter was still hiding a much larger story than anyone at that table had yet discovered. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Noah continued looking at the drawing while his small smile slowly faded into quiet reflection. Yet the sadness that usually surrounded him felt different now. Softer, less like a wall and more like a memory. Ethan noticed the change immediately. He had spent countless nights sitting outside Noah's bedroom, hoping for even the smallest sign that his son was beginning to heal. Tonight, that sign was sitting right in front of him. Emily shifted her weight slightly, realizing she had remained at the table longer than any waitress normally would. "I should get back to work," she said gently. Noah looked up. The movement was immediate, almost instinctive. "Wait." The single word stopped her. Ethan blinked. Kenji smiled quietly into his tea. Emily turned back toward the boy. "Yes." Noah hesitated. His fingers tightened around the edge of the drawing. "Did you ever lose someone?" The question seemed to surprise even him. It hung in the air between them. Delicate, honest, real. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He had asked counselors similar questions for months. Noah never responded. Yet here he was, asking one himself. Emily remained silent for a moment. Not because she did not know the answer, because she respected the question. Finally, she nodded. "Yes." Noah waited. So did everyone else. Emily glanced toward the city lights beyond the window. "A long time ago, someone very important to me passed away." Her voice remained calm, gentle. "For a while, I thought if I stopped talking about them, it would hurt less." Noah listened carefully. "Did it?" Emily smiled sadly. "No." The answer came without hesitation. "It only made me feel farther away from them." The room became quiet again. Not uncomfortable. Thoughtful. Emily continued. "One day my professor told me something I never forgot." Noah looked up. "What?" Emily folded her hands lightly in front of her apron. "He said grief is just love looking for somewhere to go." The words settled softly over the table. Ethan lowered his eyes. Kenji slowly nodded. Noah stared at the drawing in his hands. His mother had made it during a rainy afternoon years earlier. A simple picture of three people standing beneath a bright blue sky. At the bottom, she had written a small message. Ethan remembered every word. Noah had read them hundreds of times. Suddenly, the boy unfolded the paper completely and pushed it across the table, toward Emily. It was the first time all evening anyone besides him had touched the drawing. Emily looked down carefully. The picture was simple, childlike in places, beautiful. Because of it, her eyes moved to the handwritten note at the bottom. Then something changed in her expression. A faint look of surprise. Not dramatic, just enough for Kenji to notice. Ethan noticed too. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Emily looked at the message again, then at Noah, then back at Ethan. Her voice became almost a whisper. "The last sentence." Ethan frowned. "What about it?" Emily swallowed gently. "It is the exact same quote my professor used to say every spring in Kyoto." The room went still, completely still. Even Kenji's calm expression shifted. Because out of all the thousands of phrases in the world, the one written by Noah's mother was a sentence known only to a very small circle of people. And somehow, Emily Carter recognized it immediately. No one spoke for several seconds. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls while the soft piano continued somewhere in the distance. Yet inside the private dining room, every bit of attention rested on Emily. She immediately seemed uncomfortable with it. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I did not mean to interrupt." Kenji leaned forward slightly. "You recognized the quote." It was not a question. Emily nodded. "Yes." Ethan glanced at the drawing, then back at her. "How?" Emily looked down at the handwritten sentence once more. Her eyes softened. "Because I heard it hundreds of times." Noah watched her carefully, more carefully than anyone realized. Emily took a slow breath. "When I was studying in Kyoto, there was an elderly professor named Hiroshi Takeda. Every spring he would gather students beneath the cherry blossoms and repeat the same sentence. Kenji's eyes widened slightly. Professor Takeda? Emily looked surprised. You knew him? Kenji smiled. Half the academic world knew him. The realization seemed to ripple through the room. Ethan listened silently. Emily continued. He believed people spent too much time fearing endings. Her voice remained soft, thoughtful. So every year he reminded us that beautiful things do not lose their value simply because they cannot stay forever. Noah lowered his eyes to the drawing. That sounds like my mom. The sentence came naturally. No hesitation. No struggle. Ethan felt his throat tighten. The conversation was no longer about language. It was no longer about Japan. It was about Noah. About memories he had been carrying alone. Emily looked at him gently. Then she must have been a remarkable person. Noah nodded. She was. The answer came immediately. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. Months earlier, even hearing his son's voice had felt impossible. Now Noah was sharing memories. Voluntarily. Across the table, Kenji remained quiet. He understood that some moments should not be interrupted. Noah unfolded the drawing completely and stared at it again. Then something unexpected happened. He pointed toward a small detail in the corner. A tiny flower sketched beside the figures. She always drew that flower. Emily studied it carefully. A cherry blossom. Noah looked surprised. You know? Emily smiled. Your mother drew it very accurately. A faint smile appeared on Noah's face. Larger this time. Stronger. She said it reminded her that people come back in different ways. The room fell silent once more. Ethan looked away toward the window. His eyes glistened slightly in the reflection. Kenji lowered his gaze respectfully. Emily stood perfectly still, because she suddenly understood something. The quote, the flower, the meaning behind the drawing. Noah's mother had not merely borrowed Professor Takeda's words. She had truly understood them. Emily looked at Noah and spoke carefully. I think your mother wanted you to remember something important. Noah met her eyes. What? Emily's voice became almost a whisper. That love does not disappear when someone is gone. Sometimes it becomes the voice that helps us keep moving forward. Noah stared at her, then slowly looked down at the drawing again. And for the first time in nearly a year, he did not seem afraid of the memory he was holding. The conversation drifted into a gentle silence. Not the heavy silence that had surrounded Noah for months. This one felt different. Peaceful. The kind of silence that appears when people no longer feel the need to hide what they are feeling. Noah carefully folded the drawing and slid it back into his sweatshirt pocket. This time his movement seemed lighter, as though the paper weighed less than it had an hour earlier. Ethan watched every gesture, every expression, every small change. He knew this evening would stay with him for the rest of his life. Across the table, Kenji slowly closed the contract folder that had remained untouched for most of the dinner. He smiled and shook his head. I came here expecting to discuss business. Ethan laughed softly. So did I. Kenji glanced toward Noah. Instead, I witnessed something much more valuable. Noah lowered his eyes, slightly embarrassed by the attention. Yet he did not retreat behind silence. He remained present, engaged, listening. Emily stood quietly beside the table, uncertain whether she should stay or leave. The manager would probably wonder why she had spent so much time in one section of the restaurant. Yet none of the guests seemed eager for the moment to end. Ethan finally looked at her directly. Really looked at her. Not as a waitress. Not as part of the background. As a person. May I ask you something? Emily nodded. Of course. Ethan hesitated, then spoke honestly. How did you know what Noah needed? Emily seemed surprised by the question. She looked toward the window for a moment before answering. I did not. Ethan frowned slightly. Then how? Emily smiled gently. I stopped trying to fix him. The room grew quiet again. Most people see pain and immediately search for a solution, she continued. Advice. Answers. Explanations. Her eyes moved briefly toward Noah. Sometimes people do not need solutions. Sometimes they need someone willing to sit beside them until they are ready to speak. Noah listened carefully. Every word. Ethan lowered his gaze. For months he had been fighting grief as if it were a problem that could be solved. Another appointment. Another specialist. Another strategy. Suddenly he realized how exhausted both of them had become. Kenji nodded slowly. That is wisdom many people never learn. Emily looked slightly uncomfortable receiving praise. It is just something life taught me. Noah surprised everyone by speaking again. Was it hard? Emily turned toward him. What? Losing someone. The question was quiet. Honest. Emily thought for a moment. Then she nodded. Very hard. Noah looked down. Me too. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Emotion washed through him so suddenly he could not speak. Noah had finally said it aloud. Not hidden behind silence. Not buried beneath months of avoidance. Simply spoken. Me too. Emily smiled softly. I know. Noah looked up at her. For the first time all evening, there was no sadness in his expression. Only understanding. And in that moment Ethan realized something extraordinary. The breakthrough had not come from a treatment plan. It had not come from wealth, influence, or expertise. It had come from a quiet waitress who understood that healing begins the moment someone feels truly seen. The evening eventually came to an end. Outside, Manhattan glowed beneath a sky filled with scattered stars and distant city lights. Inside the restaurant, tables were beginning to empty. Staff members quietly prepared for closing. Yet the private dining room remained untouched by the usual rush of time. Ethan sat back in his chair and looked at his son. Really looked at him. Noah no longer seemed hidden behind an invisible wall. The sadness was still there. Of course it was. Grief did not disappear in a single night. But something else was there now too. Something Ethan had not seen in a very long time. Openness. Before leaving, Kenji slowly rose from his seat. He adjusted his jacket and looked toward Emily. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, with the dignity and respect that had defined him throughout the evening, he gave a slight bow. Not formal enough to draw attention. Not dramatic. Just sincere. Emily immediately returned the gesture. Ethan noticed the exchange. He also noticed something else. Kenji Nakamura, a man whose time was valued in thousands of dollars per minute, was showing genuine respect to a waitress. Not because of her education. Not because of her language skills. Because of her character. Kenji smiled. Thank you, Miss Carter. Emily looked surprised. For what? The older businessman glanced toward Noah. For reminding us that understanding another person is more valuable than winning any negotiation. Emily lowered her eyes modestly. She never seemed comfortable being praised. Noah stood from his chair. The movement caught everyone's attention. Slowly, he reached into his sweatshirt pocket and pulled out the folded drawing once more. For a second Ethan wondered what he was doing. Then Noah carefully unfolded the paper and looked at it. The city lights reflected softly across the page. After a moment, he folded it again and slipped it back into his pocket. But this time something was different. He was not holding it tightly. He was not clinging to it. He was carrying it. There was a difference. A very important one. Ethan felt emotion rise in his chest. Noah looked toward Emily. Thank you. The words were quiet. Yet they carried more meaning than any speech. Emily smiled warmly. You are welcome. Noah hesitated, then added something no one expected. I think my mom would have liked you. The room fell silent. Ethan looked away briefly. Kenji smiled. Emily's eyes glistened. Not from sadness. From understanding. She nodded gently. I would have liked her too. Noah smiled. A real smile this time. Unmistakable. The kind of smile that transforms an entire face. Ethan had almost forgotten what it looked like. As father and son prepared to leave, Ethan paused beside Emily. For several seconds, he searched for the right words. Finally, he simply said, You changed something tonight. Emily shook her head softly. No. Noah did. Ethan glanced toward his son waiting near the door. Then back at her. For the first time, he understood exactly what she meant. Healing had always belonged to Noah. Someone had simply helped him find the courage to take the first step. Minutes later, the restaurant doors closed behind them. The city continued moving. Traffic flowed through the streets. Lights flickered across the skyline. Yet one little boy walked into the night carrying both his mother's memory and something new. Hope. And sometimes, the most important voice in the room comes from the person nobody expected to speak.